here by my project colleagues seated in Kampala and also in Bonn. The Global Carbon Markets is a GIZ project whose objective is to support public, private, and civil sector decision makers to effectively use national and international carbon markets instruments to implement their climate change mitigation activities. The project is funded by the Ministry of Environment in Germany and works in East Africa in cooperation with the East African Alliance on Carbon Markets and Climate Finance. For this training on Article 6 accounting, we are supported by the International Company Perspective. This training comes in the backdrop of growing momentum for carbon markets in East Africa. Earlier in the year, we had a hugely successful regional carbon markets dialogue in Nairobi, followed by the pricing workshop by the UNFCCC in Nairobi, also as well held in April. We have pleasantly observed also national conferences held both in Kenya and Uganda, also around the topic of carbon markets. There is a steady progression of the public sector to set up the necessary preconditions to develop the market, supported by the robust growth of the private sector and even the civil service, the civil society and the communities also prominently getting a voice in the dialogues. And this demonstrates a growing interest in the market, and trainings like this will equip all parties involved with knowledge sufficiently to engage. As I was checking about the topic, I realized the last corresponding adjustment training was done 3 years ago, still by the same partnership that is implementing this one. This was just before the COP in Scotland, and since then there has been COP in Egypt, Dubai, and recently in Baku, all which have come with their wins and setbacks. Now we look ahead to Belém and still hoping for taking a step forward in building the markets. I reckon that some of you have also been involved recently in the concluded 62nd SB in Bonn in a bid to build capacity and network to enable the growth of the market. Notable also, countries are in the process of submitting their NDCs, with Kenya in the region having already submitted a very comprehensive NDC. We hope the carbon markets take a central place in the NDCs coming up shortly by the other countries. We observe also that the countries have started again signing bilateral agreements to unlock the 6.2 markets. This therefore is the right time to engage in corresponding adjustments for all parties to equip themselves better with the interpretations of the agreements and market possibilities they present in unlocking climate finance in the region. We wish you a fun-filled exchange and learning today and tomorrow. I submit.
Okay, thank you very much, Moses, for those amazing opening remarks. I'm going to hand over to Stefan Hosch from Perspectives and Perry Swawer also from Perspectives. They shall be taking us through the rest of this learning session. Thank you.
Thank you very much for taking over. My name is Stefan Hoch. I'm a managing director at Perspectives and have also with Perspectives and also our joint Climate Finance Innovators projects, we have been providing technical support for the Alliance since its inception. Shivan, please correct me, but I think we haven't gone through the formal agenda yet for the 2 days. Is that right?
Yes, that's true.
So let's maybe move it one slide up so that we can also convey a quick sense. Do you want to do that or shall I do it briefly? Because I think that's useful for contextualizing now also the content input, please.
I think you can take us through the agenda.
Very good. Thank you. So as you all know, we have been splitting this into 2 days because we all know that it's quite hard to suffer through 2 extensive webinars. So we thought we'll break this down into digestible pieces. And we will begin now, after the opening remarks, with a basic introduction to corresponding adjustments under Article 6.2. And then we'll dive into the directly related topic of authorization and use cases of ITMOs. Authorization of mitigation outcomes to become ITMOs is one of the really burning topics and the first steps on the journey to generate ITMOs. In order to make this a bit less technical and also get closer to the realities and discussions that are currently taking place in the member states of the Eastern African Alliance, we'll proceed then with host country views. from Tanzania and Uganda. So I will give the first content input, then Paris will do the second one on authorization. Paris Ferreiro from Perspectives will introduce herself when she takes over. And then we'll have colleagues from Tanzania, Irene, and also Isa from Tanzania with us. The slide somehow keeps disappearing, apologies. But so this is it for day 1, although of course maybe the most important part I skipped, because we very much look forward and want to make time for a lively engagement with the entire audience. So please raise your questions and comments, and also point us to, you know, open questions that still there are, or maybe even different viewpoints, because it's a complicated subject matter, as we'll see. Then tomorrow we'll have a more detailed walkthrough of the corresponding adjustment process, from project registration to reporting under the enhanced transparency framework. We'll also do take a closer look at the infrastructure required, the carbon market registries, country tracking system, and also reporting requirements. So how do different carbon market registry integrates, what tools are available, and we'll have both El-Haj Mbai Dian with us, who's the co-chair of the supervisory body and the associated MES panel, and of course the African representative in this forum. But we'll also have representatives from the gold standard, because it's also important that we get a good understanding of the coexistence of these different instruments, again followed by a panel discussion. So this is the full overview of the 2-day program. I would now move into the first substantive presentation. If you can move 2 slides, please. Thank you. Here, so corresponding adjustments. We have talked a lot about this for many years and haven't seen it yet much implemented in practice. So I think there's a lot of mythology also around this concept, and we hope to demystify a little bit. Paris will go into a bit more detail on actually how Article 6.2 itself is relevant, but what I want to establish first is that in contrast to Article 6.4, Article 6.2 is not a mechanism. Article 6.2 is primarily an overarching framework, accounting and reporting framework for any type of carbon market mechanism. That could be for bilateral cooperation, it could be for the Article 6.4 Paris Agreement mechanism, or it could also be for other instruments that we don't see yet. But it's clear that primarily Article 6.2 is an accounting and reporting framework. And one of the key features in this overall accounting approach are corresponding adjustments. So what do we mean by that? It has been probably one of the most important subject of controversy on how to prevent double counting. So really what corresponding adjustments are supposed to achieve is to prevent double counting, meaning that each mitigation outcome is only counted once. That could be for an NDC, also for other purposes. We'll get to that. So corresponding adjustments are really a safeguard against double counting. And there are different forms of that, double use, double claiming, etc. Again, I'll get into more detail. And overall, the corresponding adjustments will take place actually in the biennial transparency report supporting documentation. So corresponding adjustments are not just an Article 6 matter, but they are really the interface between Article 6 for carbon markets and of course non-market approaches as well, and Article 13 for the enhanced transparency framework. So a lot of the accounting and reporting that we have to do is actually not just for carbon markets, it's for the NDC, because that's the purpose of the BTR, is to demonstrate progress against the NDC targets. And if there are now transfers of mitigation outcomes between parties, that needs to be captured in this reporting. And that's why we have this interface between Article 6 and 13. So that's the first thing. And now, how do we approach this? First, of course, one has to understand the NDC targets, because we should also always remind ourselves purposefully about that. Having carbon markets is also not an objective in itself. Carbon markets are one among other instruments to help countries achieve the NDC target. and of course also to stimulate private investments and innovation and so on. But carbon markets under the Paris Agreement always have to be understood in the context of the host country NDCs and also the buyer country. Then the second step is to determine the Article 6 accounting approach. This has to do with that there are single and multi-year targets. Again, we'll go into more detail. Based on that, the annual emissions balance needs to be calculated. That has to do now with the greenhouse gas inventories countries are keeping up, and then report progress based on that. And if there were any transfers of authorized mitigation outcomes, then the corresponding adjustment needs to be applied and also reported to UNFCCC. So that is the first impression of the sequence. I apologize for a lot of technical terms, but I think it's also good to socialize them a little bit. Okay, so again, the most important objective of corresponding adjustments is to prevent double counting, not only between NDCs, but also to other mitigation purposes, such as the ICAO COSIA mechanism for the aviation sector. So whatever the use case is, each ITMO should only be available to be uniquely used once by the appropriate user. Next slide, please. Again, I mentioned there are different forms of double counting that could be relevant. So the overarching summary is that carbon credits would be counted more than once, or the mitigation outcome, actually, I should probably say, because the most well-known case is that multiple parties claim the emission reduction or carbon removal from the same ton of CO2. So that we have one credit that is counted both by the seller country, but then also the buyer country. So I think that's a fairly well-known case. I'll not go into much more detail. But there are also other varieties, such as double issuance and double claiming. Double issuance could occur if there is no careful oversight and there is a crediting of the same ton of CO2 reduced or removed from different crediting programs. So for instance, under a bilateral scheme, but then also maybe in an independent crediting program designed for the voluntary market, because perhaps the boundaries of the systems weren't established properly. So that is a risk that's a little bit less prevalent than the double use, but still it could exist and we need to be aware of that. And then at the same time, there could be double claiming, and that goes beyond carbon markets, but we should also prevent that the same emission reduction is claimed through a carbon crediting program and then also an associated greenhouse gas inventory emission target, but then also another program that could claim the same mitigation purpose. So in all of these cases, double counting undermines environmental integrity of mitigation targets and also creates an inaccurate representation of actual mitigation achievements because we're counting one ton twice. Next slide. Now, again, I apologize for a relatively high level of abstraction, but it is a topic that requires a certain level of technical depth. So here we're trying to describe how corresponding adjustments affect NDC goals. Because remember, we want to use carbon markets for achieving NDC goals, and in order to do this in a high integrity way with sufficient transparency, we need to have the appropriate accounting provisions. So here we start by, at a very introductory level, a participating party, which you see here on the left-hand side, the host country. There's various columns, I'll get to those individually, has achieved a mitigation outcome and wants to transfer that to another buyer in order to monetize the carbon credits. So here, it's clear that a corresponding adjustment must be made regardless of whether the emission reductions are in the NDC or not. That is the first provision. So some countries already have economy-wide NDCs, but other countries have excluded certain greenhouse gases or maybe also sectors that were not yet on the radar. The cooling sectors with hydrofluorocarbons is one classic example that we don't yet have in all NDCs, but there could also be others. So when the host country has reduced the emission, which you see here in the red dotted line, And it transfers that for the buyer country to use against their NDC inventory. You can see that the higher blue bar in the acquiring country is higher than the actual NDC target. And that means that the actual emissions of the buyer country are still relatively high, represented by the blue bar, and the additional mitigation that the country buys through the carbon credit is then adjusted in the emissions balance the country reports. So it's subtracted, so to speak, from the actual physical emissions in the inventory, and thereby the country reaches its NDC target, which you can see in red, and it's at the same level as the adjusted emissions balance. So that's how it looks like on the buyer country side. So we can see the country has managed to reduce their ambition, increase their ambition beyond the actual achievement of mitigation. It's going beyond what is in the greenhouse gas inventory. And that is why, of course, the buyer country cannot count the same mitigation twice. But now the complication comes in that seller countries have defined usually unconditional and conditional targets. And so when we speak about the NDC here, in this case, it is the entire NDC. A country could have reduced emissions within the conditional scope of the NDC. And so the NDC would still be met, but the accounting has to be done properly once. You can see here also use for NDC and use for OIMP. This is one of the provisions also in Article 6 where a certain share of the mitigation needs to be subtracted, so to speak, and cannot be counted by anyone. Because the idea is that carbon markets need to go beyond simply certifying 100% of all the achieved mitigation, but only a certain portion for it in order to preserve integrity and conservativeness based on experiences, with overcrediting in the past and the related controversy. Next slide. You'll see a very similar picture. Now, going through the specific potential situations that could occur. So here now we assume that the mitigation comes from the conditional NDC target of the country. So as I said before, we have the same picture. You see in red the NDC, including the conditional and unconditional target, not distinguished here now. We see the emissions in the greenhouse gas inventory. We see an emission reduction achieved again in the red yellow dotted line, and then an adjusted emissions balance that is now more or less adding back the mitigation outcomes that are transferred abroad back into what is being reported in the annual emissions balance. So even though the physical emissions in the buyer country are lower because emissions have been reported, they have to be added back in order to perform this corresponding adjustment. So it's really an accounting and reporting step, so to speak. And the UNFCCC has in the past, and here I also reference the corresponding adjustments workshop you mentioned earlier, a few years ago, referred to that as double bookkeeping, so to speak, which we know from accounting in other cases. Good. And here, of course, what you see with the 3 dots are the 3 types of known use cases established by Article 6. So it could be used for an NDC, could be used for other international mitigation purposes, which is code and primarily refers to CORSIA, potentially other such instruments in other similar transnational sectors, such as shipping, where there's an ongoing discussion, but clearly going beyond NDCs. And then there's the famous use for other purposes, including the voluntary carbon markets. And for all of these use cases, the country can specify for what use cases it authorized that mode transfer. What we've seen so far is that there was blanket authorization for all types, but it could differentiate in the future. We'll see. Exactly. And here the key takeaway is that even though the adjusted emissions balance is higher than the inventory emissions because of the corresponding adjustment, still the adjusted emissions balance is within the scope of the national NDC, the conditional NDC target, and therefore the authorization and transfer does not jeopardize the NDC achievement. So if the mitigation comes from the conditional part of the NDC, all the quality checks are done for generating the credits and all the accounting and reporting is done, the country has still met the NDC. This is very important. Next case, please. Here we now come to a case where the mitigation outcome would be generated within the country's unconditional NDC. And that, of course, is intended to be achieved with domestic resources. So here, then the conclusion to now take that away at the beginning would be that the transfer of mitigation from the unconditional part of the NDC would jeopardize NDC achievement, and we get a situation where potentially we could get into what a lot of people call overselling. So selling more than the NDC target would allow. And so this distinction between unconditional and conditional targets is extremely important. Unfortunately, it's not defined in the UNFCCC rulebook because it is a practice that countries have chosen to apply. And that mismatch between the real world practice and the Article 6 or Paris Agreement rulebook more broadly, because it also actually relates to Article 4 especially, that is dealing with mitigation and NDCs, is creating a bit of lack of clarity. So here you can see the NDC is lower than the national inventory for the mitigation activity and also afterwards. So here we would require an additional emission reductions to be achieved to substitute what comes out of the unconditional NDC target. Because here the country has promised to do it with domestic resources, but then if the credit is transferred abroad, that would then require some additional mitigation elsewhere to substitute and get back to the same level of what was promised unconditionally. Next slide. Yes, here we get to a case where the mitigation achieved is outside of the NDC. So not in the unconditional or conditional, but outside. Example I gave earlier, for instance, when there is emission reduction potential in gases or sectors that are not covered by the NDC. So here, that is in principle also possible. And the country is free to also authorize these kind of potential ITMOs. But then again, the corresponding adjustment would lead to that the country has to add back to its annual emissions balance the additional mitigation that was sold abroad, even though it wasn't even part of the NDC. So that is also then a complicated situation when it comes to NDC target achievement. In reality, of course, we need to see whether, as NDCs are becoming economy-wide, whether that is a problem that will vanish as the NDCs will become increasingly comprehensive. And in those countries where all the emissions already covered, that is not applicable. But if there is a country that has not yet completely covered all emissions, then we also need to think about these situations. But in principle, first we need to understand, is the mitigation part of the NDC? And if yes, is it part of the unconditional or the conditional part, in order to determine whether an ITMO transfer impacts NDC target achievement. I know this is a little bit heavy stuff, but we'll move on and resolve any open questions later in the discussion. So unfortunately, I need to add a little bit further complication or hopefully explanation. Countries have different features in their NDC. So one of the main distinction is a multi-year or a single-year target. The difference is that in a multi-year target, the country defines from the beginning annual emission reductions and precise steps on how to get there. So that's what we call multi-year NDC target. And if that is available, then it's relatively easy to know for which year how many emissions are available and what could be potentially transferred. But if we have single-year NDC targets, which most countries have chosen to do, we need to think about options for accounting that get us to annualized emissions budget, so to speak, which are then the basis for performing the corresponding adjustments. Here, we still have a gap in the Article 6 rulebook, which doesn't exactly prescribe how countries should do this. And that was part of the decisions also then taken before last year at the COP, when it was decided among the negotiators that the precise negotiation on corresponding adjustments would be deferred. And also not until this year, but until 2028, unfortunately. So we still have to live a little bit with some further uncertainty regarding the Paris Agreement rulebook, but we already see a lot of now practice emerging in those countries that are moving forward with implementation, because we cannot do carbon markets without corresponding adjustments. So bilateral agreements and others have come up with solutions. So what we see is, on one hand, the continuous multi-year trajectory accounting approach, where the country calculates the trajectory based on the modeling for the NDC, that then leads to annualized budgets, which are then the basis for reporting and applying the corresponding adjustments. The alternative approach, and there are technical discussions around which one is better, is that the country calculates every year the average amount of ITMOs it has transferred or used over the years of the NDC implementation period, and then averages that for the target year, because remember, it was originally proposed as a single-year target. And now I've already mentioned that, I think, sufficiently clearly, but I also wanted to say it in writing here, that this target conditionality is also really important, that the unconditional target should not be available for international transfers, because it has been indicated that the country intends to achieve that with domestic resources. For conditional targets, it's different. It was clear these are dependent on international support, and that can come from carbon markets. Next slide. And that is also the last one I have. This visualizes now a little bit also the sequencing of how this will be implemented. So host country has to apply corresponding adjustments after authorization and first transfer of the ITMOs, and then the first transfer triggers the corresponding adjustments. And you can see here in these steps, typically what we would expect is that first the host country authorizes mitigation, then the mitigation outcome is generated and verified, meaning carbon credits become available. Then after the transfer really is when the host country has to undertake the corresponding adjustment, and at use, when the using party has to undertake the corresponding adjustment. I think we've already sufficiently clarified the link between the annual emissions balance, so I think the other points we can skip for now, and I thank you very much for your attention and would like to hand over to Paris. We have a slot for Q&A afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. So my name is Paris. I am a consultant at Perspectives Climate Group, and my work mostly focuses on providing technical support to host countries and private sector on carbon markets and climate finance. So for today, I will be taking you through authorization and the various use cases, as well as just the whole thing on authorization. So please let me know if you can see my screen, but I hope you can. Good. So Article 6.2 provides guidance for trading internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, also known as ITMOs, from Article 6.2 cooperative approaches, applying to all types of carbon credits. So basically, when carbon credits are authorized, they are transformed into ITMOs, and this provides specific guidance on the trading and the use cases of these units, which include bilateral crediting mechanisms, such as the JCM and the CLIC under the Swiss government that we've seen with bilateral cooperation, for example, between CLIC and Ghana. And then also there is an option to internationally register or internationally transfer the credits under other crediting mechanisms, such as the PACM, also known as the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, and for other domestic crediting mechanisms. So this basically provides larger frameworks for ITMO generation and trading. We also see another approach where ITMOs are used under the VCM, so the voluntary carbon market. So this also creates independent use cases of the ITMOs. So this could be under accrediting programs such as Core Standard, Vera, Plan Vivo, that allow credits to be sold voluntarily in the market. And then we see other use case, which is government-to-government transfers. So this is also a key part of the ITMO system, which provides flexibility and enhancing bilateral cooperation in meeting climate goals. So ITMOs, we've heard a lot about it, but what basically they are is that they have to represent emission reductions or removals that are real, verifiable, and verified through established methodologies and additional beyond what would have occurred without the crediting mechanism. ITMOs also are emission reductions or removals that are measured in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent and or other non-greenhouse gas metrics, ensuring that the mitigation activity has a measurable, verifiable impact on the environment. And basically the ITMOs are authorized by a host country. So a host country plays a central role in ITMO process and authorization. So there are various applications of this. So one can include authorization towards another country's NDC, so such as the example that Stefan mentioned, that ITMOs may be transferred to help another country meet its NDC under the Paris Agreement. Another use case would be authorization for international mitigation purposes. So this could be under the airline program, CORSIA, that Stefan also mentioned. So allowing carbon credits to be specifically used for international mitigation efforts, and among other purposes such as voluntary offsetting and other agreed international purposes. So once an ITMO is authorized by the host country, it is tracked, transferred, which automatically triggers the corresponding adjustments in the host country annual emission balance and is reported in the UNFCCC. So this is an important step because the corresponding adjustment ensures that the country's emission reduction accounting remains accurate and that no double counting has occurred in the global carbon market. So another term that is used and has also been referenced earlier is the fast transfer of ITMOs. So it is a crucial moment for the host country as it triggers the application of corresponding adjustments. And it's a core principle of the Paris Agreement that underpins the credibility and the integrity of the carbon market. So this next slide covers the rationale for Article 6 authorization. So basically at the heart of Article 6 engagement lies the host party authorization, as I mentioned. So it's a formal approval that unlocks various steps in the carbon credit cycle, from project development through registry issuance and finally the transfer of the mitigation outcomes. So authorization ensures environmental integrity. So by requiring rigorous authorization, host countries can enforce Paris Agreement integrity criteria that includes additionality, baseline setting, monitoring, and permanence, and basically applies more strict national safeguards compared to what we saw with the CDM. So there are various safeguards on protecting against overissuances, leakage, and that ensures only verifiable emissions are entering the market. Authorization also ensures that sustainable development objectives are upheld, and that it allows governments to screen projects for alignment with its NDC as well as other national development plans and social and environmental priorities. So this can be manifested as co-benefits, so job creation, biodiversity, conservation, community health, so that every credited activity advances broader sustainable development goals. Authorization also ensures that there's robust accounting. Once an ITMO is first authorized, the host country applies a corresponding adjustments in its national greenhouse gas inventory and also makes a report on their biennial transparency report. So this avoids the double bookkeeping mechanism or issue that ensures the same ton of emission reductions cannot be claimed twice. So maintaining integrity between the host country NDC and the buyers of their credits. And finally, authorization ensures financial compensation. So it's not just a box ticking exercise, it also funds the administrative backbone. So countries can do this by having fee structures that are levied at the application, issuance, or transfer, and it covers the cost of technical reviews, registry operation, and ongoing oversight. So yeah, this is a sustainable model also for national authorities that are responsible for authorization. Yeah, so this is quite a lot, but I think in sum, I can say that it's a robust authorization framework, and it has its various benefits, including safeguards, issuing safeguards, channeling carbon finances to sustainable development, and yeah, that's what I can say about that. Yeah, so my next slide mostly just goes through the various processes from issuance until authorization, so I can quickly take us through it. So at the very top, we'll have the mitigation activity. So this could be an e-mobility project, for example, or geothermal or the clean cook stove. So that one, we call it a mitigation activity. So once the project developer develops the project developer design document, the project design document, they can then register into one of the crediting programs. So we have in the VCM, we have the Gold Standard Bearer and other various ones. And then they can also choose to work with the compliance one, which is now the Article 6.4. And then other bilateral crediting programs, such as with the JCM. And yeah, that also includes other domestic crediting mechanisms that are present. So once the mitigation activity is registered under a crediting program, it generates carbon credits. And then here we see two scenarios where on the left side, we see the carbon credit being authorized by the national party or the host party. And here we see different use cases for authorized credits. So one, as I mentioned before, would be compliance towards the host country NDC. Another would be voluntary offsetting under the VCM, and also compliance under other voluntary schemes such as CORSIA for airlines. And the other scenario where the carbon credit is not authorized, they don't necessarily count towards the host country's NDC, but they can use for complying with domestic policies, for example, to reduce carbon tax liability, for delivering results-based climate finance, such as making payments against the delivery of Article 6 for emission reductions as proof of results, and for voluntary contribution towards host countries' national targets. Yeah, and then the next slide just kind of summarizes the authorization process. So I won't go into very much detail, just also looking at the time. But the process here is quite simple. So on the left side here, we have the host country, and the right, we have the activity developer. So this process just shows how they interact with each other to get to an authorized carbon credit. So authorization under Article 6 has to be anchored in a national climate strategy. So that can be the NDC, or is the NDC. So the host country defines a clear participation criteria. So that can be in the form of an eligibility criteria, and I'll go a bit more into that. And all this can be embedded in in a national Article 6 framework, but it has to be rooted in the NDC. And then on the right side here, we have the activity developer or the project developer. So they begin by scoping and designing their mitigation project, then proactively engaging the designated national authority or the DNA, who is responsible for communication between the host country and the secretariat. So this engagement ensures that the proposed activity aligns with the national goals and meets technical and procedural requirements before the formal application. So once the project developer submits a request for authorization, typically that includes a project description, methodology references, and monitoring plan. The DNA then conducts a technical and policy review. So this steps checks additionality, baseline settings, safeguards, and alignment with the NDC. And then once that is done, we've seen various countries offering letters of intent. So this is optional. So some host countries issue this non-binding letter of intent that indicates that the host country is supporting of this mitigation activity. But as it is optional, it still gives the project developers confidence to proceed with detailed design and financing preparation, knowing that the project is likely to get authorized. So, I mean, after satisfying all the criteria that has been communicated by the host country via the DNA or whatever national authority that does the communication, they will issue a formal letter of authorization. So it's commonly known as an LOA. So the LOA is the definitive government approval that allows the project to generate ITMOs, and it also commits the host party to apply corresponding adjustments. So once this is done, the LOA and the fact that the corresponding adjustment will be applied has to be captured in the host country's initial report or biannual transparency report to the UNFCCC. And tomorrow we'll also go into detail on the ETF and various reporting. And also if there's any corresponding adjustment or authorization towards CORSIA, that will also need to be registered in the ICAO registry for CORSIA. So this public reporting cements the transparency and avoids double counting. And so now with a letter of authorization in hand, the project developer will or can implement the activity. The verified emission reductions are issued as carbon credits in the national or international registry as with the UNFCCC, and they would be tagged as authorized by the host country and available for transfer to the buyers. So this is kind of like a full circle process from mitigation activity all the way until the carbon credit authorization. So experience from early authorizations should feed back into the host country's Article 6 criteria. So, depending on how the first few authorizations went, the host country could refine timelines, fee schedules, or technical guidance to help streamline future reviews and build market confidence. I'm speaking a lot, but I promise I'm almost done. But the next slide here kind of shows us the authorization template. So this is the one that is provided by the Secretariat. We have 3 forms here. So the first one is on authorization for Article 6.2 credits or ITMOs. And then we have Article 6.4 form for ITMO transfers. So we have one for projects and another one for program of activities. So this authorization template from the Secretariat provides a standardized, more transparent format for countries to grant official approval for ITMOs. And so key sections from the templates include including project activity identification, so the registry name, project title, also the number of units to be authorized, as well as vintages is included in this form. Also, both the forms require the DNA to write the purpose of use. So with the different use cases that we mentioned before, so compliance with another party's NDC, CORSIA, or voluntary cancellation, this is where the host party will indicate that. Yeah, I mean, more specifically per template, very high level. So the Article 6.2 template specifies that the credits are distinguished between units used towards another party's NDC versus those ones that would be retained domestically, and that it requires declaration of the date of transfer and the receiving party's identity to ensure bilateral transparency. And yeah, for the Article 6.4 templates, I think they're also pretty straightforward. They distinguish between mitigation types also of the activity, including emission reductions or removals or both. Also indicates methodologies for these mitigation activities, the activity levels, and yeah, I think more specifically, the host country typically would use the template as a letter of authorization. Once the activity meets the national criteria, they then would file it via the UNFCCC online portal, which then triggers the registry updates and the host's obligation to apply corresponding adjustments. Yeah, so I think the official templates here offer guidance and are available on the UNFCCC website. And yeah, it ensures all parties have access to the latest versions and filing instructions. Yeah. Also, I need to mention that there's, I think I already mentioned.
Paris, I think let's
yeah.
move more quickly so that we have enough time for the panel. Thanks.
Yeah. Good. So I just have 2 more slides left. But yeah, so basically what national eligibility criteria is that most countries must ensure that only those mitigation outcomes that genuinely support their climate goals can be authorized for international transfer. So establishing clear eligibility rules is key to safeguarding national ambition and avoiding the risk of overselling. So the single most important criteria here is to minimize overselling, that any credits authorized for international transfer must come from emission reductions or removals that are part of the host country's conditional NDC targets. So this protects the country's ability to meet its own commitment. Yeah, so I can also just say here, another crucial requirement is that the emission reductions or removals attributed to a project must be reflected in the national greenhouse gas inventory, which Stefan has already mentioned a bit earlier. And yeah, the national eligibility criteria can also inform a host country's white lists and positive lists. I think we've had this term being used. So basically a whitelist could be defined as a broad menu of activity types or technologies deemed eligible by default by streamlining authorization for proven approaches, while a red list here would then imply the exclusion of these activities. A positively list is a narrow set of high cost or high value interventions automatically recognized as additional. And yeah, I think here I could just say ultimately a well-designed national eligibility criteria serve as the backbone of a high integrity Article 6 framework. So the criteria must ensure that carbon credits not only contribute to real climate impact, but also protect the host country's own NDC ambition and preventing overselling and maintaining the credibility of the national carbon market. My final slide just goes step by step on different stages of authorization up to corresponding adjustment. So a host country has to define the scope of its Article 6 use. So the very first step here is to determine how a host country intends to use Article 6 in the context of its NDC. So this includes identifying the purpose for which the host country will authorize ITMOs. And at this stage, the country must ensure that any carbon credit transactions align with the country's overall climate goals. Step 2 then defines or develops the national authorization process. So this involves defining roles and responsibilities for the entities responsible for providing authorizations. So this could include ministries, environmental agencies, and other relevant authorities. Establishing legal, policy, and institutional arrangements, as well as authorization procedures that could be clearly laid out to facilitate smooth and predictable processing of ITMO requests. The third stage is on developing authorization criteria. So once the framework and authorization is in place, the host country should develop criteria for authorizing ITMOs. So yeah, again, to prevent overselling and to contribute positively to the achievement of its NDCs. Yeah, and then the fourth step then would be to determine the accounting approach for corresponding adjustments. So here the host country must determine the method for applying corresponding adjustments. So this will include whether the reduction in emissions will be reflected in the host country's national emission accounting and how it will be reported. And the final step is on tracking and reporting on authorization. So host countries must develop national arrangements to track and report on authorization process. This is essential to ensure transparency and accountability. And again, tomorrow we'll speak a bit on the enhanced transparency framework that provides a reporting tool for transparency. Yeah, but in summary, this is a step-by-step process for determining how Article 6 will be used to track and report on authorization. And it ensures that countries can engage with carbon markets, aligning with its long-term and sustainable development objectives. Yeah, this is my final slide. And Stefan will take us through the different use cases for ITMOs. Thanks.
Thanks, Paris. We're slightly behind schedule, so I'll keep this very brief, not going into the technical details. First use case is, of course, the NDCs. That's clear, so we thought that's sufficiently clear, so we don't include it here explicitly. And then the first case we are presenting now is ICAO CORSIA. Most likely, many of you are already familiar with the scheme as well, but just to say, the international aviation sector is not within the scope of NDCs, because it's a transnational sector. That often happens also, across land that is not national jurisdiction. And therefore, there's a separate mechanism for that. So basically, the corresponding adjustments provides a link then between those different instruments, the Paris Agreement, CORSIA, etc. So it is an offsetting scheme that is supposed to offset further emissions growth, but part of that obligation can be met with international offsets. I'll keep it there. Next slide. But there are a few more interesting aspects we should go into. First of all, CORSIA has various phases. It has been around for a while, and so is discussion. But we see now that we are now moving into the compliance phases slowly. Phase 2 in particular. And so far, there is a number of carbon crediting programs accredited directly by ICAO for eligibility of the credits to be imported to the CORSIA mechanism. You see the list here. The CDM is there, the gold standard, Vera, the well-known ones. We don't yet see the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism, but that is more to do with formalities, because this list was already produced in October last year, and then from a very formal point of view, the Article 6.4 mechanism was only finalized at the COP in Baku end of last year. and then subsequent regulatory standards developed, and basically, if I represent this correctly, the view of the Secretariat is more or less just a question of time and process. Is there a need of a separate application? But everybody clearly expects that the 6.4 mechanism will be most likely fully eligible, maybe with some qualifications for certain technologies or so, also for COSIA. Next slide. So why we also need to have corresponding adjustments here is also, like the Paris Agreement, COSIA has the stated objective to avoid double counting. In the pilot phase, credits could be used also from countries without targets. And in phase 1, all countries now have targets, NDC targets, and therefore we must avoid double counting. That's why we have these different qualifications in the authorization statement. So what did we see so far? Only very few ITMO authorizations from Ghana, Thailand, Guyana, but the actual corresponding adjustment will take place at the earliest this year. Final slide. So this is actually quite interesting because so far we've seen a relatively small number of countries committing to use Article 6 credits for their NDCs. A lot of seller countries, of course, a fewer number of buyer countries that have committed already to the use of the instruments. You see them here. And then you see in proportional representation then estimated demand from COSIA, which at this point of time is expected to be larger than from NDCs until 2030. So this picture may change, of course, when the full list of NDC 3.0 updates is there. We hope so, especially on the demand side. We clearly need ambition increases. But I think this is interesting because it helps us get some perspective on what Article 6 credits will be used for. And with that, I thank you and hand back to Paris. Oh no, actually, sorry, there's a slide with some key takeaways. But we'll do this very quickly and it's more documentation. So, oh, we have the VCM as well. We have too much stuff prepared for you today and we are not fast enough. But that's good. So you are all familiar with the voluntary carbon market, so we'll not go into much detail there. I've already explained earlier that Article 6.2 is an accounting framework for all of these different instruments, including VCM. But the main point is that there are different use cases for credits. The classic offsetting claim, but increasingly also what people call a contribution claim, where you don't claim to offset the emission, but to contribute to climate action, so to speak. And what we see in the market is there's a clear price premium for adjusted credits or authorized credits that will be adjusted in the future. So we see price premiums for ITMOs, and that leads to a situation where countries now are under a lot of pressure to provide that. And what is really important is to also look into newer use cases for carbon credits like contribution claims, because that may be one way of taking off that pressure a little bit. Final slide, the key takeaways. So we need corresponding adjustments. They're absolutely crucial for the transparency and integrity of carbon market functions, and without that, they will not work. And we see some precedent now under the bilateral agreements, but under UNFCCC, we still need to finalize the rulebook. So unfortunately, we have to live with that uncertainty. A lot of the work that is needed for that is taking place under the BTR. And the decisions on the accounting approaches actually is something that countries need to really start thinking about in more detail, I think. Authorization is the first step towards delivering corresponding adjustments. Paris has shown the templates. There are some open questions remaining, referring to what I've discussed earlier about NDC features and target conditionality. And as I said just a minute ago, a lot of pressure on DNAs right now. And I think these open questions, frankly speaking, make their life quite hard. And that's why we need a lot of good work, discussions, further capacity building, learning about good practice, and discuss on how these challenges can be overcome. Because we are now in a very early stage of the new phase of the carbon market, and these really are the cornerstones for its functionality and integrity. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. Yes, thank you also for all the ones that have posted their questions on the chat. We will address them during the Q&A session. But for now, we would like to invite Tanzania and Uganda. They prepared a presentation for us. So from Tanzania, we'll be having Isa, who is or was the CDM DNA. So Isa, if you are here, please unmute yourself and have your camera on. And then we'll have from Uganda, Ms. Irene Chekwoti, who sits at the Ministry of Water and Environment at the Climate Change Department. And she's the acting Article 6 for DNA. So Irene, if you're here with us, please unmute yourself and have your camera on. And yeah, maybe I can call upon Tanzania first to make its intervention. Andrew, I see you've unmuted yourself.
Oh, yes.
First, I was just going to let you know. No, it's
Okay.
okay. I think Andrew can take it.
Yes. I have unmuted just to flag that Uganda, there's an issue that came up, so she had to step away actually from this meeting at the last minute. But Tanzania is represented by Deo Shirima of the National Carbon Monitoring Center. They are in charge currently of carbon market systems development in Tanzania. So I'd like to invite Deo Shirima to give his remarks on Tanzania's experience and Tanzania's.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I don't know if you can hear me. Hi, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you also for the presenters. I mean, it was a very fantastic presentation, and I learned quite a lot as well. Unfortunately, I didn't have a PowerPoint presentation, but I think I can speak overall our experience as a country when it comes to the Article 6 and 6.2. So before I do that, my name is Deo, and I work at the National Carbon Monitoring Center, which in February this year, the government of Tanzania has through the parliament has clearly stated or authorized the National Carbon Monitoring Center as a technical arm of the DNA, which is responsible for registering, maintaining and working with the registry, but also doing the greenhouse gas inventory for the country and overseeing the carbon trading. Still, the way it's structured, the Vice President Office, the Division of Environment under the Permanent Secretary will still be the DNA and our focal point, but under it, the National Carbon Monitoring Center will be an agency which works as a technical arm to run the registry and also provide all the technical requirements for implementing carbon trading within the country. In 2002, we, as part of preparation to Article 6 and all the carbon trading issues in the country, in 2012, we had a regulation which provides a clear guidelines on if someone wants to do a carbon project in Tanzania, how should you go about? And this includes our internal process of registering the projects, some of the integrity checks that we look at the projects to ensure that most of these projects are in line with our NDC and also national circumstance, but also we looked at how the projects will also have benefits to the community. So the part of the sustainable development is the key in our regulation. So one of the main things that we're looking at is on environmental integrity, but also how those projects benefit the communities and the issue of sustainable development
in general. But also we are looking at in the center we're developing a whole unit dealing with social safeguards, but also biodiversity safeguard with the projects. So getting to the question specific on the Article 6, so far we have in the regulation, we have a provision to provide an intent to correspondence adjustment, and we have issued 2 of them at the point, and these are mainly on the energy sector. We are reviewing our NDC in the NDCs 3, and we are going to include the areas, activities that will be under the conditional and some that will be under the unconditional. We're still working on that. We have concluded recently our greenhouse gas inventory, and now, as we speak, there's work ongoing, working on the NDC, and we are planning to submit the NDC by September this year. We are also working at the BTR, and that will also be concluded by September. So at the moment, the criteria that we use, it's also to issue the letter of intent, and maybe soon we'll issue our first correspondence adjustment to an energy company that is working on a carbon project in on energy, clean cooking energy. And this will be actually because our vision, our 2050 vision, we are very much into the climate resilience, and energy is one of the key part, because as a country we want to have a climate ready nation which is capable of safeguarding its people and powered by affordable clean energy, as well as effectively managing the greenhouse gas emission and low carbon in future. So this is one of the targets, aspiration targets in our 2050 vision. And that's why we are foreseeing that in the first place, we might put an adjustment this year. Some of the activities will lead into the energy as well. But the details will be we are concluding the details of the activities, and I think by September we should be having a clear, ready NDC for the market. Yeah, maybe I should end there, and if there's a question, then I would respond.
Thank you so much. And let me just get my screen in order. So, okay, good. Thank you so much. Do we have any questions to Tanzania? You feel free to unmute yourself or ask your question in the chat. I guess I can start. Okay, so I see a question here, I think addressed to Dale. Maybe Teresa, would you like to ask it, or I'm also happy to read your question?
Informative explanation how the case is in Tanzania. So I was wondering to get a deeper understanding if for what cases those corresponding adjustments and ITMOs are used. Maybe you can provide there more details. Thank you a lot.
Thank you, Teresa, for the questions. If I'm allowed to respond quickly, yeah, they are for, they have been requested for Corsia market.
Thank you a lot.
You're welcome.
We have another question from Owen. Maybe you can have this as a final question and then we can move on.
Yeah, so thank you, Owen. The question is on with the issuance and correspondence adjustment, your BTR in September. Is this following the signing of the letter with authorization for the project? I didn't get the question properly, but what I said is that we are working to do our BTR, and the two in pipeline that we will authorize, they will also be reported in the BTR that we're going to submit by September. I don't know if that was the question. If I didn't get it, please you can ask it again because I didn't get it. And then the other one is on whether Tanzania has a plan to annual reporting once it's approved. Yes, we have that plan, and we are also working tirelessly to in the initial phase to set out the registry. So we are approaching different partners to work together to finalize and update our registry so that we'll be able to track properly the NDC. And then the other one, I don't know if I'm allowed to continue, but the other one is to support for conditional NDC come from the international carbon markets, but all transfer require correspondence adjustment. How will the host country ever achieve the NDC then? I don't know if this was
I
for
think
me
this
or
was this was for Stefan. But
okay.
I do have a question for you. Just as a final question. So what criteria did your office use or Tanzania use to evaluate the eligibility of this carbon market activities for corresponding adjustments?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, that's a good one. So we have set a number of criteria, and this, in addition to the ones that people, developers are meeting on standards, we have our own criteria. One is, which is it's key. It's on the benefits that the projects will bring to the communities. So we have a very clear criteria saying about benefit sharing mechanism. So each project should include the clear process of not only meeting the regulations and the standards and paying the fees that we're about, but also when it comes to benefit sharing and making sure that the benefits go to the communities that are participating in the project. That's one of the key. But the other one is at the moment, as a country, we have more projects projects that are ongoing, but others that are on pipeline on voluntary carbon markets. And one of the issues that we are also looking at is if we should provide a correspondence adjustment, then what additional environmental but financial gain that we get in terms of the price that will be sold. So this is one way that we have been looking, but we will adjust the criteria and more clear as we do our second NDC and do the activities that will be applied for the correspondence adjustment or under Article 6.
Thank you very much for your answer. I think Owen also elaborated on his question. He says, I was just trying to understand if these projects have letters of authorization from your agency or whether this will just be shown in the biennial transparency report with a corresponding adjustment.
Yeah, so they will have a letter of authorization from the NDA. So our agents will do the technicality and recommend it to the National Designated Authority, and the letters are issued by our minister. So, but they will have these letters, and then we'll put this into the report as part of reporting.
Good. Yeah, I mean, now that you're here, I think there's another question that's been taking precedence here. So, for example, is Tanzania looking into revoking any authorizations? Do you have any conditions for revoking authorization, transfers, and how do you define this and communicate this, if you've thought about it so far?
No, not yet. We are still working on taking this carefully. We have chosen an approach of a stepwise approach. So this is the next step. We haven't yet get there yet. Okay. I hope by September we'll be able to have some clue on whether this is going to happen.
Thank you so much for that. Good. I think we've exhausted all questions to Tanzania. Unless there's a final questions, I think the rest are more general that Stefan and I will address.
I think there's one in the chat by Angola on annual reporting. Have you seen that one? Does Tanzania have a plan for annual reporting once it approves Article 6 projects? From the chat. From Madikisela, Angola.
Yes, yes. I think this is where we are heading. Like I said, we are in the process now of setting out the registry, and we want to have a digital one, so that this will support the process of registry. We are working to get the national greenhouse gas inventory and the MRV system in a digital format, but also the registry in a digital. And then by so doing, we'll be able to generate the annual reports. So that's where we're heading.
Good. Don't think I can see any other questions for Tanzania. So thank you very much. We can have a round of applause for Dio.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so is there anyone who has a question and is free to unmute themselves and ask? Otherwise, we have the ones in the chat that we can also start addressing. In the meantime, Judy, please.
Thank you. And my question is on the biannual transparency report expected in September. It would be good to hear how is Tanzania planning to account for the private sector contribution to the finances received in the country. We've seen in other countries only accounting resources approved through the national budgetary system, but which leaves out private sector, which becomes a hard assignment when they're also asking for the corresponding adjustments, given that some of the private sector are financing their projects using loans. How is Tanzania capturing that? Would be a good lesson to reflect on.
Yeah. Thank you so much for. I think it's a very good question, and I wish Isa was here also to comment on this. But we have started the process of the BTR, and like I said, as a country, and we have also other processes that are taking place, trying to tracking the private sector contribution. It's a little bit tricky, and we have had a lot of engagement recently as we are reviewing the NDC3 to try and capture what is coming from the private sector and their contribution. In terms of the bilaterals and the multilaterals benefits that is contributing to climate, we have some work that has been done in reviewing the achievement of the NDC2, and that will give us some informations on the finance that we may use them in the BTR and also as we go to the NDC3. But given the situation we have, because we have been almost 80% of the projects that have been in country before we did the regulation in 2002, they have been asked to comply, and around 80% of them, they have complied already. We have some few cases where they have not yet complied. So we are in a position to track from 2003 up to now, how the private sector has been contributing, those that are in the process of developing, and whether they are taking loan or it's upfront payments in developing of the projects. We can track that now because we have a system in place to track and register all the projects at the moment. But I think it's a stepwise process. We are just starting, including looking at those that are registering with us, but also did some review to capture the other multilateral or bilateral agreements and all the fund that's going to the finance. And the good thing is all this is being centralized through the Ministry of Finance and the Vice President's office, which works together. And now with the National Carbon Monitoring Center, which it's in between as a hub to connect the sector ministry on all these issues related to climate and carbon finance, then we will be able to at least start by adding in the BTR some of these reports. I don't know if I've answered the question, but please, if
Yes, you have. Very comprehensive. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Judy. Next, we have Jamie with his hand or with their hand up.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I work with a project developer that does clean cooking projects. And I have two questions, if you don't mind. The first is about authorization statements and the template for them. There was some discussion, Paris, in your section of the presentation about the UNFCCC template. This template, we have been told by insurers who we've approached for Corsia insurance, does not meet their requirements because it does not contain an arbitration clause. And we've been invited to develop a different authorization statement. I'm wondering if any of the panelists would comment on that. And in particular, do you think that the UNFCCC template is actually adapted to what we could describe as an ex ante authorization? For example, when you read some sections of it, it refers to the vintage years where the mitigation activity occurred using the past tense. So in some respects, it looks like a document that a host government would use to report the authorization once given, but is somehow not adapted to making a prospective or an ex ante.
Thanks for that, Jamie. I think I can have a first attempt and then Stefan can comment. Yeah, I mean, I think we are right. It might not be an extensive template, but I think, since it's the UNFCCC, we often recommend it. However, there are other templates that are out there that I think are more comprehensive. I think there's one from MIGA, there's one on Click. But yeah, I'll let Stefan answer a bit more in detail about that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I was expecting that most likely we're discussing about MIGA here. So UNFCCC is primarily concerned now here with, following the Article 6 rulebook and the 13. And the arbitration aspect is really something that's, let's say, within the market. UNFCCC doesn't really, let's say, follow the transaction once a credit has been transferred out of the UNFCCC registry, except for the ITL and these kind of overarching architectures. So I think, it's I think legitimate from a market practitioner perspective to point out, what are the weaknesses in the UNFCCC dialogue. If I understand correctly, there are some aspects in the MIGA template, some aspects of the Article 6.2 rulebook that are not fully captured yet, and that shows us that all the templates are not perfect yet, and have different strengths and weaknesses. I think it's important that we get to a consolidated, practical template very, very soon that both fully takes into account the Paris Agreement rulebook, but also as much as possible the needs of the market. I think that much is what we can say right now, but I do acknowledge, there's strengths and weaknesses among the existing templates, and yeah, I think that's all I can say.
Jamie, you still have your hand up.
Actually, I did have one other quick question, if you don't mind. It's about first transfer. I don't know if this will be covered tomorrow, but when the ITMOs are to be used for other international, there are 3 definitions: cancellation of the mitigation outcomes. And I would just appreciate hearing describe those in a little bit of detail, particularly with respect to the trade-offs or they might represent. If the host government hasn't made its own determination about that, or if there's a discussion between a project developer and a host government around which of those definitions to choose, I'm trying to understand how to make that choice.
Stefan, do you want to take that?
Shall I? Can you just quickly list again the use cases you want to get more elaboration on?
Yeah, it pertains to the definition of first transfer. So I guess when the first transfer is occurring for achievement of the NDC, then it's the first international transfer of the mitigation possible definition of first transfer. But when the mitigation outcomes are authorized for use for OIMP, the parties, so I guess the project developer and the host country, need to specify the definition of the first transfer event. And the UNFCCC guidance offers three possibilities: authorization, issuance, or use and cancellation. And I'm just wondering how the parties should be thinking about the trade-offs between definitions.
Yeah, it's a little bit complex to unpack, I think, because it also relates to this discussion on timing of authorization that we have. And again, I think we need to distinguish 6.2 and 6.4. It can apply to both. I think in general, if authorization applies to is given before the issuance of the credit, which many project developers also want, right? As early as possible to get the ideally at registration or even validation. So then I think one couldn't consider authorization as a legitimate interpretation of first transfer. So that would only apply, I think, if the authorization is given at the point of issuance, and then you would have kind of the same interpretation. Of whether it's at issuance or at authorization, that would be the same then. But I think if authorization is happening before issuance, then clearly that couldn't be considered a first transfer. I also think cancellation could only be considered a good interpretation of first transfer if the credit is generated and then, let's say, immediately sent to the cancellation account in the registry. If the credit is being transferred to another account from the holding account of the original project owner, so to speak, I think then clearly that is the most obvious definition of first transfer. And then you could have, I slightly disagree with what you had earlier, because one could, of course, have a situation where a credit is used for an NDC and it is passed through the hands of various intermediaries. But generally speaking, I think what we are trying to promote and work towards is that first transfer means the first transfer out of the registry in which the credits was issued. And that could be direct cancellation. It could be transfer to, the account of either the final user of the credit, or it could also be an intermediary. So these are the different implications, but I think that's as much as I could say now, and I recognize it's not as coherent as maybe you wished for.
No, thank you. That's actually very helpful. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
We have then Sakti, please.
So hi. So I have a question. So in terms of this Article 6.2 and 6.4, you clarified that it can be used only towards the same NDC in which the credits are generated. But if the buyer country has already met its conditional and unconditional NDC targets, then buying the credits as ITMOs from another host country doesn't add any value towards the buyer country. So is there any provisions that lets the buyer country to use the ITMOs towards its future NDC targets under Article 6? And the rule that you say, which is, the credits has to be consumed in the same NDC period, is it only for Article 6.2 or is it also for Article 6.4? And when it comes to this other international mitigation purpose like CORSIA, even it can be the credits ITMOs generated from previous NDCs can be used towards future OAMPs like CORSIA is my question. And one more thing is like December 2024 is the deadline for BTR, but I could see that most of the countries haven't filed the BTR. Is there any new deadline to do it? So that's my question.
Please invite me to. I don't want to just take all the questions because I want to make sure that all the panelists have sufficient time. Does anybody want to go first? Okay, so on the BTRs, yeah, at the BTRs, I think, it's I think countries are at various stages of preparedness. It's the first time countries have to put together a BTR, and the BTR, of course, is quite heavily based on the inventories. So I think in cases where countries are still working on their inventories, which is often directly linked to their NDC updates, which is something that is also delayed and ongoing, then I think, it's understandable to some extent there's a delay. I don't think there's a real deadline, and if so, it would be indicative. It is the sovereign prerogative, I think, of parties to either meet or not meet those deadlines. I think primarily from what I can see is that in many countries, it's simply a question of available human capacity and sometimes maybe also still capability. I have heard also from the Secretariat that host countries have not fully requested the available means of support, meaning funding in particular, to prepare the BTRs. So I think in some countries it may also be a lack of attention, but so no clear picture there, but I would expect them to come in on a rolling basis. And hopefully once the NDC updates are finalized, countries have more headspace and also then the right data foundation to complete the BTR. Now, I don't think we try to say that, a credit can only be used for the NDC in which it was generated. If it's non-authorized credit, yes. If it's a credit under 6.4, which was established also with the Article 6.4 rulebook, the so-called mitigation contribution units, yes, these can only be counted towards the generating the host country NDC. But any other ITMO can in principle be used by other countries for the NDC as long as it's properly authorized and accounted for and reported. So in that sense, host countries need to be able to have the required frameworks to provide all of those accounting and reporting and authorization steps. And then for the buyer countries, it's exactly the same. On timeframes, we do have the rule that credits should come from the same NDC implementation periods for which they are intended to be used. So that means that we couldn't use, as per the current rules, a pre-2030 credit for a post-2030 target. But everything that would be generated within this decade until 2030 would be eligible for the current NDC period. I hope that answered all your questions. If not, then please come back.
Yeah, it answers well. Thanks a lot.
Maybe you can have a final question and then quickly address the ones in the comments and then have Andrew wrap up. So Gabriel, please.
Thanks. Stefan, actually, this was a question I put in the chat. If I understood well, one of your slides stated that an emission reduction outside of the NDC, if traded, would still need a corresponding adjustment. And I was intrigued by that, if you could expand.
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. Any ITMO transfer requires a corresponding adjustment, and the idea is to also not have incentive structures that lead to countries define their scope of the NDC as small as possible, to have a larger pool of mitigation available for international transfer outside. So I think you could basically look at that as, first of all, in the context of that, the Paris Agreement is already very clear that all countries should have economy-wide NDCs or should move towards that as fast as possible. So I think it only touches some smaller sectors that are outside of the classic basket of greenhouse gases that are covered in all NDCs. But the idea is that Article 6 really is an instrument to enhance ambition and not to allow for any loopholes, accounting loopholes, to make credits available that are then, outside of the scope of the NDC. Because what the BTR reporting then also shows is, in particular, those emissions that are covered by the NDC, and then that's an incentive. You could basically look at it as an incentive structure that should compel countries to expand their NDC scope in that spirit that I mentioned, moving towards economy-wide NDCs.
But Stefan, from an accounting perspective, you would subtract this emission reduction from where? Unconditional, conditional?
You would actually add them back. So you would have the physical emission reductions in a sector that is not covered by the NDC. So, and that's the reason, because the emission reduction or removal, it wouldn't show in the inventory of those sectors covered by the NDC, but still 1 ton of CO2 is transferred internationally. And that's why there's this provision to add the additional ton that is corresponding to the transfer, needs to be added to the annual emissions balance. Okay.
Good. I don't think we have more time, but Sakti.
Yeah. I have one follow-up question to Stephen. When he said that the credits generated till 2030 can be used towards the same 2030, but few countries have 2025 as their first NDC, and many countries have 2030 as their first NDC. So a credit generated in 2022, 2023, or an ITMO generated in 2022 to 2023 can be used till 2030 is what you mean. Am I right?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. That clarifies.
Very good.
Good. We can quickly go through some few questions in the chat, just also looking at time. Let me just see the one that has the most reactions. So again, there's a question, will the ITMO be valid if the host country doesn't achieve its unconditional NDC or conditional NDC? I'm not too sure. Sakti, you had asked this question.
Yeah, I was referring to, if a country, let's take an African nation, sells it most to another country, and they don't achieve their own unconditional NDCs. So will the ITMO still be valid, or they can revoke the ITMOs, or is there any risk to the ITMOs that has been generated? Is my question.
I would say I think this also goes to the question I think Gabriel had earlier on overselling. It kind of touches on that. So I would say, so for example, if the country A says that they want to sell ITMOs to country B, that then contributes to country A's conditional NDC target. So again, it's conditioned that it receives international support. So then the corresponding adjustment is then goes to host country or buyer country B. But then the host country needs to either have credits that is counted towards its NDC, so the unconditional part. So, this can also, again, be with the MCUs, the mitigation contribution units, that can also go towards the host country NDC. And these are the not authorized credits. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, but I would like to just really make the point very clear that as long as the accounting and reporting is transparent and all other Article 6 rules are met, mitigation from the conditional NDC is available for international transfer. and there is no need to then replace the transferred credits from the conditional part, whatever we call them. That is the most important foundation, I think, of this.
It answers well. Thanks.
Good. Unfortunately, we can't get to the last few questions, but maybe I can just get one final one, and then I'll hand it over to Andrew for wrap up. Let me just...
May I suggest one question? It's come up twice.
Okay, please.
Just want to check if we have responded to it adequately. So this is from John, and it came further down as well. On the withdrawal of LOAs by government, LOAs are more or less a guarantee, that the private sector are looking at for investment. But what happens if the governments at the end of the day do withdraw these letters of authorization? Are there any guarantees that we have examples of how countries are going to ensure that once they've issued an LOA, it cannot be withdrawn by government?
Yeah, I think that is one of the main purposes of the bilateral agreements, which are legal treaties that are supposed to prevent exactly that. And of course, a number of other things too. But here, I think the benefit, especially for the buyer country, but potentially also others operating within those bilateral frameworks, have a legal certainty that there will be no politically motivated revocation. And that is also why I think many countries have been hesitant to issue letters of authorization, because they take it as a very serious matter, not to overpromise, because they see that risk. Now, the main question is what happens to credits and projects that are outside of these bilateral agreements. For instance, also any Unpacking project that is not embedded in a bilateral cooperation or otherwise. So here we need to see about the conditions for revocation that are supposed to be explicitly stated. The little experience we have in actual letters of authorization all includes very thin, very generic language. So I don't think we have a best practice example yet that I'm aware of, but I hope one of the members of the East African Alliance will create a very good practice soon for us to share.
Thanks. I think, Andrew, it's safe to hand over to you with the remaining time.
Yeah, thanks. I think I can run with it. We do not have much time, but then what I'd request is that there are some questions that we haven't responded to. If you could just do a quick run through the chat section and provide as concise responses as possible, so that the participants will feel that we have so that we actually will have responded to the participants who have actually joined us through this time. With that, I would like to express gratitude. Thank you for everyone who has joined us. We were almost at 200 at some point, I think. And it shows a lot the interest that has been placed into the carbon markets, especially as a means of financing climate action. It's for the benefit of our climate commitments, but at the same time, it is a highly business sensitive sector. It's something that we all acknowledge. I'd like to appreciate the team from Perspectives, Stefan and Paris, who gave a very concise, very good outline of corresponding adjustments, talking through the basics, what corresponding adjustments are, how doing a bit of a deep dive into the technical aspects of actually doing transactions, corresponding adjustments, authorization, and use cases as well for ITMOs once corresponding adjustments have been made. Thank you very much, Dale Shirima from NCMC, who gave Tanzania's case. Tanzania is in the process, and very glad to see how well thought out their carbon markets regulations and structures are coming along. Thank you very much for sharing that, Dale. A lot of the discussion will now hinge towards some of the more practical technical parts of doing corresponding adjustments, some of the structural needs that we have, things like registries. I know there was almost a question, I saw it coming, somehow the conversation veered away slightly, but there was a question coming around on registries, and then the notion of interoperability. And tomorrow we will have a discussion on that with Melaj Mbai coming in, and then David Hines from the Gold Standard giving the case about registry use. And the way they see it from the voluntary carbon market perspective, the way they see corresponding adjustments playing out. With that said, all the recordings from today's discussion will be shared by email before we meet tomorrow at 2 p.m. East African time. I would like to thank the team in the background for the organization that has come towards this. The team from, again, the Global Carbon Markets Program, were all present actually for this engagement. Thank you so much. And from Perspectives, we appreciate you, the constant support towards the Alliance and towards the building of carbon markets in East Africa is well recognized. So for now, I'll wish you a very nice evening, and I look forward to connecting tomorrow. You have a nice one.